A major thing I love about the quote-unquote Deltarune experience has been anticipating major content drops for the game, knowing from the very start that we would only get pieces at a time. Starting on October 31st, 2018, the world was introduced to Deltarune, a parallel story to Toby Fox's hit indie game Undertale. A day before, on the 30th of October, a mysterious figure took over the official Undertale Twitter account and hinted towards something that would come the next day. The next day came, and people were greeted with a website with a download for a program on it. Said program just called Survey Program. When people booted up the Survey Program for the first time, what they didn't expect to find was a new game from Toby Fox. Besides for an out-of-context teaser placed within the Nintendo Switch port of Undertale, released 3 weeks prior, there wasn't really much to suggest that Toby Fox was ramping up for a new release. Going a bit off script here, I just kind of want to present in a very personal way what it felt like to experience this firsthand. At this point in time, Undertale was 3 years out from release, and while it was certainly still in the cultural consciousness, it had well past its peak of popularity at this point. It sort of felt like Deltarune Chapter 1 released at the perfect time to bring back in all of the people who liked Undertale that were starting to forget about it. While I didn't necessarily love Undertale any less than I did when I had an obsessive phase over it, I was definitely starting to drift away from it to focus on other things. The lack of any content drops really, save for the occasional Easter egg or new bit added to a port, didn't really bring my mind back consistently either. It was really strange going from not knowing when we'd get anything Toby in the future to having the next game from Toby in our laps for free. I was still in high school when Deltarune Chapter 1 released, and I remember the day of release trying to download Survey Program onto my laptop using a hotspot on my phone because the school Wi-Fi that I was normally connected to blocked the Deltarune website. I remember flying kind of low and sitting in the back of all of my classes after downloading Survey Program, because as soon as I realized that this was a real game I could play, it was like nothing else mattered in that moment, and the only thing I wanted to do was immerse myself more in this new world. It looked like Undertale, albeit with somewhat more complex art. It played like Undertale, albeit with more thoughtful gameplay. Characters from Undertale were there, but they were mostly kind of sidelined for the new characters. And I did not know what this game was called until I beat it for myself. It was just so much of a step up from everything I already loved about Undertale, and it was so mysterious, and it was so in your face and confident in its own new vision, and it was over before I knew it. Toby had spent the last 3 years since the completion of Undertale's development basically solo working on this project, something he conceptualized after having a fever dream in 2011. Despite Deltarune having been conceptualized first, Undertale was a stepping stone for Toby to eventually build up enough muscle to be able to realize Deltarune as he originally conceptualized it. However, there was only so much Toby could do himself, and after 3 years of work, only one chapter of Deltarune was completed. There's a quote I'd like to call attention to from a twit longer that Toby released after Deltarune Chapter 1. When will the next chapter come out? This is a difficult question. When I made the demo of Undertale, I made it to prove to myself that it was possible to make a whole game alone, with some help with the art. Because I was able to make it in a few months, I felt that I had proved that it was possible. However, making the demo of Deltarune took a few years. So given the length of the rest of the game and how long I'd be willing to spend on a project, 7 years maximum, I think the answer is that it is actually impossible to make this game. Toby then goes on to broadly explain that the scope of the game he has in mind can't really be made in a timely manner with just him being the major workhorse. Thusly, he'd need to assemble a team if he wanted to make the rest of the game. And so, just as quickly as Toby had come back with something new, he had gone once more, leaving us with a vertical slice of something incredibly exciting which we may never get any more of. luckily, we wouldn't be waiting very long until our next progress update on Deltarune, which we would get in September of 2020. Throughout 2020 and 2021, information on the development of Deltarune Chapter 2 was mostly a steady trickle from sources like Toby's Twitter. It wasn't until September 15th, 2021, the 6th anniversary of Undertale, during a Fangamer stream where an altered version of Deltarune Chapter 1 was played, and after it was completed, footage of what comes after was briefly shown, before cutting to a release date of 2 days away from the end of that stream. People knew Chapter 2 of Deltarune was coming and was progressing at a steady pace, but Toby, always erring on the side of caution, kind of led a lot of people, or at least me, to believe that we were a lot further out than we actually were from getting the next installment of Deltarune. So of course, everybody I know and the entire internet collectively loses its shit as Toby Fox once again drops another chapter of Deltarune in people's laps. As much as I've engaged with Deltarune chapters 1 and 2 over the years as pieces of art directly in front of me, a very large part of engaging with Deltarune involves waiting for more content and losing your mind in the meantime. It's more than just a game at this point. It's something I've been experiencing firsthand for the last 6 years since 2018. It'll be 7 years as of October this year, and oh my god, I cannot believe it's been that long. When Deltarune Chapter 1 came out, I was in the middle of high school. When Deltarune Chapter 2 came out, I had been out of high school for a year. Now, with Deltarune Chapters 3 and 4, I've been out of high school for over 4 years now. It feels like every time I change and grow as a person, Deltarune is right around the corner to change and grow with me, as it has been for the last almost 7 years. To me, Deltarune has almost kind of felt like a friend that I'm not in very consistent contact with, but whenever we do talk to each other, it's like a day hasn't passed. I go through these long stretches of time where I don't really think about Deltarune, and then something reminds me of it, and all of a sudden I just feel the claws of obsession gripping my skull. This game, even when not completed, with just 2 out of seemingly 7 chapters done, is something that means the world to me. I can tell it means a lot to others too, because every single time we get even just an inkling of new information on Deltarune, or some post from Toby on his Twitter, or even, God forbid, a release date for the next cluster of content, the internet goes wild, and all of a sudden, Deltarune is everywhere. It's just kind of fun to be a part of this big movement where everybody is kind of on this one thing at the same time. I felt that with Jujutsu Kaisen in its final arc of the manga, following it week to week, participating in discussions with my friends, spreading memes that came on my timeline. That sense of harmony and community with a bunch of people you will never ever meet is such an interesting feeling that makes things like Deltarune coming back in the cultural consciousness for a little bit that much more potent and excitable. It helps too that Fangamer does things pretty consistently to keep up general interest in Deltarune and Undertale, as well as Toby and his crew communicating somewhat more consistently now. If you're not a few months out from the last sudden concept art post by Toby on his Twitter or the last newsletter, then there's a good chance you're probably at least somewhat close to some Fangamer event like the Spamton sweepstakes. The main reason why I wanted to make this video was to document some of these feelings I have as we move into a new era of Deltarune, quote unquote. After Chapter 2, for almost 4 years, we have had just these 2 chapters to work with, and now, all of a sudden, we are getting 2 chapters at once, versus having to wait 3 years like we did between Chapters 1 and 2. I don't know how else to describe this feeling, so do you know when you apply to a job and they call you in for an interview, and afterwards you have to wait for them to call you back, and you get this feeling of anxiety in your stomach because you're on neither side of knowing if things are going to stay the way they were before or if they're going to change, and all you can really do is just sit there and wait until things resolve themselves? That's something I've been feeling pretty consistently for the last 2 months since we got the release date for these new chapters on April 2nd. With all that said, I think now's a good time to get to some of my thoughts on Deltarune chapters 3 and 4, since this video is released releasing after I've had the chance to play them.
Your screen, the show that makes you scream. Say it with it, folks. Mr. Antenna's TV Show.
So soon into the beginning of Deltarune Chapter 3, I did not expect Ralsei to open up to Susie about the truth of darkness being objects. There was this sort of expectation among me and my friends, and even the broader fandom I want to say, that expected Susie to not learn this information for at least another chapter or two. The way Toby gets this reveal over with and uses that as a way to slingshot itself into covering Susie and Ralsei's dynamic further, I really like. My expectations at this point pleasantly subverted. I then find myself completely bewildered by a character who makes his presence very quickly known. From some of the teasers we'd gotten between 2021 and 2025, we knew that there was a character named Tenna who would be in Chapter 3. The real surprise with Tenna's character came not from his existence, but from the way the game conveys him. While prior to this, Deltarune had flirted with the idea of using 3D in its gameplay, it hadn't used it to the extent that it would eventually with Tenna and his sprites. I don't want to say I thought 3D models turned into sprites for characters wasn't possible after 2 chapters, but I was content with the style that Deltarune had found itself in. So to see the style evolve so sharply really stood out to me. In fact, at first I was just kind of so overwhelmed, like I was already locked into the stuff with Susie and Ralsei, so for Tenna to just show up and completely mop the floor with my expectations, well, that's gonna stick with me for the rest of my life. Real quick, I just want to show off this clip I got where I had to plug in my microphone after meeting Tenna for the first time just to capture my thoughts. Oh my god! Oh my god! This fucking game! Oh my god! Oh my god! This is so self-indulgent. I feel like with how much Deltarune equates sort of escapism and fiction and art to something that can be like like something that consumes your life to a negative point. This story just having an arc like this is so telling of the love for storytelling and escapism and fiction in general that Toby Fox and his crew has going into this. Oh my god. Oh my god. Oh my As you can tell, despite stammering out some form of analysis, I was still at a loss for words. It wasn't just Tenna and his production quality that really spoke to me too, it was the purpose and the structure of the whole arc within the narrative, and the way all of the ideas were presented to us. I find it so fascinating that Toby wasn't confident in his vision of this chapter, despite going out of his way to do it the way he wanted to, just because it fits so seamlessly with what Deltarune is trying to say about how escapism can be a benefit to our lives. I mean, let's look at Susie. Ever since she started entering the dark world, she's made more friends and memories. Her life has gotten demonstrably better by having this form of escapism directly in front of her. Let's look at Ralsei, the Prince of the Dark, made to assist the Lightners on their journey. In theory, he shouldn't be giving into escapism, but because he's becoming his own person, and because he's being influenced by Chris and Susie, he gets influenced to stop and smell the roses, just like they want to. What feels like the game telling us, hey, stop for a moment, let's have another fun adventure, becomes the whole story and characters being aware of the fact that, yeah, it feels good to go on these adventures every once in a while. Of course, things can't stay low stakes forever. If the characters get too caught up in the escapism, they'll forget the whole reason they're in the dark world in the first place, but just for now, let's play some of these games that this weird TV man says he wants us to. With how much Deltarune goes out of its way to separate the existence of the player from the existence of the cast in story, I just really like the way that our motivation and the motivation of the main characters happens to align with Chapter 3. That motivation being, let's have some fun while we're here. I just really like the way this active acknowledgement of the fun part of Dark Worlds as a form of escapism ends up leaking into the tone of this chapter. It's not all sunshine and rainbows forever though. It takes the characters 3 long rounds through Tenna's game show to realize, hey, these games are getting kind of boring, and also we have a dark fountain we need to seal. Which is when the whole veneer of a game show setting that the characters are exclusively invited to have fun in starts to fall apart. Whether they like it or not, Tenna wants them on the game show. And so, the ugly part of overindulging in escapism starts to rear its head, including the fact the main characters probably should have seen this coming were it not for the fact they were too wrapped up in having fun. It's not a bad thing at all for Susie or Chris or Ralsei to want to have fun in this dark world. The bad thing is arguably the fact they got so blind because of all the fun that they couldn't see how shady Tenna was. The player and the main characters are particularly in harmony with Chapter 3 due to the way Tenna lures you into letting your guard down. He starts off as a very unassuming character, but there are little glimpses of darkness you do get pretty early on and throughout the runtime of Chapter 3. Even when his darkness starts to slip, you don't expect it to come out the way it does. He's not a particularly spiteful or vengeful character, he's just kind of sad. And I really like the way that his actual fight against the main characters is just a desperate struggle to maintain the thing that he feels he's losing his grip on. It really humanizes him as a character, and above all, I just think it sets him apart from all the other antagonists we've had so far. But that's enough about Tenna and the fact that Chapter 3 intentionally acknowledges itself as a piece of escapist fiction. Before we move on to talking about Chapter 4, there are a few more things I want to mention that stood out. Number one, and I know this is cheating because I said I wouldn't talk about Tenna anymore, but it's not really related to Tenna. I like the way that the actual setting of the chapter is mostly framed around game shows / television shows / video games rather than extending to being a dark world about the whole of the Dreamer household. By being more specific in the visual and thematic elements that the dark world primarily focuses on, it feels as if it allows itself to be more creative because it's trying not to wear too many hats. Number two, I really appreciated that the chapter was willing to go out on a limb and introduce all of these minigames / extra elements for gameplay purposes. The fact that Toby Fox was the reason Game Maker now has a feature to launch multiple different games from the same point proves to me that Deltarune trying to feel like a different game with each chapter is very much intentional, or at least Toby and his crew are leaning into that somewhat with certain aspects of certain chapters, like Chapter 3 having things like the point system replacing dark dollars as the main currency for buying items. I do very much appreciate the creativity that Toby Fox and his team are now afforded because of this. Despite Chapter 3 being really creative in its own right, it feels like things can only get more creative and cool from here. Number 3, I just really like a majority of the enemy designs that appear in this chapter. Like, the enemies themselves are fun to fight within combat, but they're also just really cool designs. There's so many new act mechanics that are offered with these new enemies, and it just feels like an even bigger step up in the Mercy gameplay than Chapter 2 already did off the back of Chapter 1, which itself felt like a pretty big step up from Undertale. Number 4, new Toby Fox content drop means new music to celebrate. So how about we listen to a little bit from all of the songs I really liked this chapter. I overall really liked the Chapter 3 original soundtrack just as much as I did Chapter 1 and 2 soundtrack, though if I did have to say one thing, not all of the songs are as iconic as Chapter 1 and 2 soundtrack, I think, although that is something that is rapidly changing as I have time to sit on and listen to all of the songs over and over again. I've especially found that with a lot of songs from Chapter 4 specifically, but we'll get to that. And lastly, number 5, I find Chapter 3's characterization and dialogue writing to be across the board fantastic. With shit like the water cooler enemy just saying bubble, to Susie and Ralsei's similarities yet differences being further emphasized as the two grow from being around one another, or even with Tenna consistently singling out Chris in a lot of their dialogue, basically saying stuff like, "Hey Chris, remember when your parents were still together and you used to watch TV together with them? Remember when you used to watch TV with that other family and then the older sister of that family went missing and both of your families stopped talking and your mom divorced your dad?" So much of the writing in Chapter 3 is either heartfelt, heartbreaking, or hysterical, sometimes all three at the same time. My favorite example of this being the way that Tenna is characterized. Despite his outward confidence, his actual attitude almost makes it seem like he could be blown over at any moment. He clamors so sharply for validation from others because he feels abandoned as an object that naturally lost use because of the Dreamer divorce, that he often acts in ways that don't really feel like a human would, but makes sense for a Darkner, being an object given life and memories. I just really love the way that Tenna ends up acting as a converging point between the funny, the sad, and the cool moments of Deltarune Chapter 3. Of course, despite being one of Chapter 3's coolest characters, Tenna has nothing on the Roaring Knight and the fact they make their first appearance at the end of the chapter. While most of the things I would mention liking about Chapter 3 comes way before talking about the Roaring Knight, even I have to admit their first time appearance was raw as fuck. I very distinctly remember the pit I had in my stomach after the fight with Tenna when I saw the Roaring Knight for the first time. A small part of me was stunned because I had already started to believe that Knight was just a term associated with somebody who opens up a dark world, and not the fact that the Knight was a singular character making each dark fountain. The rest of me, though, was thinking, oh my god, I used all of my healing items during that fight with Tenna, and all of my characters are still really low on health. To which the game replies, yeah, that's pretty bad, and then throws one or two attacks at me that are really hard to dodge and instantly knock out my characters on hit. I know there actually is a way to beat the Roaring Knight, and there is a way to make sure it doesn't do boatloads of damage to you with each hit, but having missed the secret boss on my first playthrough, I didn't know that, so I just assumed the point of the fight was to get bodied. I'll tell ya, one hell of an impression for the Roaring Knight to make. Showing up uninvited at the end of the chapter after I've already beaten the final boss just to style on me and prove I'm not strong enough yet. I really felt powerless, as it seemed almost like the game took a boss from chapter 6 or 7 and dropped it right at the end of chapter 3 when I wouldn't be prepared. That feeling of powerlessness against this foe was definitely meant to be intentional too, with the way the knight kidnaps Undyne and then immediately retreats within the bunker. It feels like if all of chapter 3 gameplay wise was meant to convey that you should indulge in escapism sometimes, then the end of chapter 3 is the cold hard crash back to reality, as not even escapism can take your mind off of what's in front of you. With this first overwhelming defeat at the hands of the knight behind them, the main characters enter into the next day with less answers and more questions. I think Deltarune Chapter 4 has to be the most narratively dense chapter we've gotten so far. There's a lot of things we learn in this chapter that have very wide-reaching implications for where the story may go in the future, which I have to admit is nice to get after the plot starts to feel like we don't really know where it's going to go, with Chapter 3 breaking the patterns that Chapter 2 seems to go out of its way to set up. During a church service early that day, Chris and Susie ask around to find out if anybody would know how to get into the bunker. They discover that Mayor Holiday, Noelle's mother, might know how to get in, and the code that she might have would be kept in her house for safety reasons. Chris and Susie then reach out to Noelle and ask about studying at her house so they can have the opportunity to search for clues. Once you do this, you can either leave the church and go straight to Noelle's house, or you can walk around hometown for a little bit before going to Noelle's house. This leads us to one of my favorite things about Chapter 4, the fact we get 3 separate opportunities to explore the light world at different points in time. In Chapter 1, the only way we're able to explore the light world is after we've beaten the Chapter 1 dark world. In Chapter 2, you're blocked from exploring the rest of town before going into the library by a traffic jam. It's only after you complete that chapter's dark world that you're able to explore hometown once again. Meanwhile, Chapter 4 goes, you want more light world? Okay, you can explore the light world after church, you can explore the light world after the holiday estate, and you can explore the light world after beating the dark world. That good enough for you? Yes, it very much is. With Chapter 3 being set entirely in the dark world across the night between Chapter 2 and the day of Chapter 4, it's nice to get some extra light world content in Chapter 4 to offset the fact we don't get any in Chapter 3. There's a really cool scene you can get where you go and have a meal at QC's diner with Susie, and I just really like the way that further emphasizes her bromance dynamic with Chris. Like, despite Susie being a woman and Chris being non-binary, they have very strong 2 dudes that have known each other for their whole life energy. This animation of them pouring juice into each other's mouths during church is really, really funny. Actually, in general, there's just a lot of really expressive sprites across the whole of Chapter 4. If Chapter 3 felt like a more grandiose ratcheting up of the budget with characters like Tenna, I feel like there's a much quieter iteration in Chapter 4 with how much more expressive the sprites get. Not to say we don't get more expressive sprites in Chapter 3 too, it just feels like Chapter 4 puts a lot more emphasis into the expressive sprites by nature of having a lot more grounded time with these characters early on. Okay, so we gotta go to Noelle's house to search around to find if the mayor keeps the code for the bunker there. Susie distracts Noelle with a display of pure teenage sapphic romance while Chris snoops around the house. Here's another thing I really like about Chapter 4's light world sequences. There are a lot of points where you can kind of just sit around and listen to Noelle and Susie talk, and they are really, really cute together. Like, out of every single relationship that has either been implied or actively focused on across Toby Fox's works, I find Susie and Noelle's relationship to just kind of be the most heartwarming and fun to see navigated. I really like the way that Noelle is falling for the bad girl, not just because that's what their dynamic specifically sort of implies trope-wise, but because Noelle is a character that fundamentally finds comfort in the uncomfortable. Noelle as a character is endlessly attracted to things like horror movies despite being very skittish and easy to scare, because in part these things that scare her are more upfront and consistent and controllable than the actual things that have hurt her and scared her in the past. And then you've got this whole facet of Susie not really actually being a bad person, but somebody who puts on the bully persona because of the way other people prompt that reaction from her, slash generally because her upbringing demanded she need to have this abrasive exterior. I don't want this to just become the part of the video where I talk about how much I love the complexity of Noelle and Susie's dynamic, so I'll cut it off there, but just, you know, I just have to say from all of this, it's nice to see more of these 2 teens very clearly in love, trying to not acknowledge that around each other. One of the things I definitely want to see at least one last time within the last 3 chapters of Deltarune is another sequence where Susie and Noelle are alone with one another, because the will they won't they that the 2 of them have between each other is a very fun thing to see whenever it comes up. There was a room that Noelle said was not open to guests, which you can go in and explore after Susie starts distracting Noelle. This room used to belong to December Holiday, colloquially referred to as Des. Across chapters 1 and 2 of Deltarune, there were vague lines here and there which implied that Noelle had a sister named Des, who, for some reason or another, wasn't in hometown anymore, and nobody wanted to talk about why. It was as if she just disappeared one day and never came back. I was already excited when Tenna name dropped Des as December Holiday, but for Chapter 4 to more directly go into stuff about who Des was before she disappeared, that made me really happy. Under the bright and happy visuals of Hometown, there is this darkness that the story has been implying since Chapter 1. There was this incident between the Dreamer and Holiday families, which not only led to them no longer being friends, but led to Chris's parents divorcing. This event is also probably related to what led to Asgore being kicked off of the police force, and when Asriel, Des, Noel, and Chris went to explore the bunker just behind the graveyard. I already really liked the outline of the mystery of December Holiday's disappearance that we got in previous chapters, but the way Chapter 4 iterates on this by making it so much more clear yet unsure, I absolutely adore. After exploring December's room for long enough, eventually you will examine the guitar leaning up against her closet. Inside the guitar is a code for the bunker, but before you, that's right, you the player, can fully read it out, Chris tears out their soul and leaves the room. Chris throws the player-controlled soul into a box and leaves the room. From there, we can push a box in front of a vent out of the way and actually explore the house through the vent system. There's no way to access the room of Noel's parents normally, but you can see a little bit inside if you go up through the vents to the vent inside the room, in which you will see what looks like an investigative corkboard and a black sword. This is one of a few things the game does specifically to try and imply that the knight could be Carol Holiday, Noel's mother. Throughout the chapter, though, there are also some other implications that the knight could maybe be December Holiday, in some kind of post-darkness zombified state, like an homage to the Masked Man in Mother 3. The way Chapter 4 goes out of its way to narrow down the candidates of who could be the knight, while still making it unclear across the candidates that it does convey, it's fun, you know? I like the fact that who the knight could be isn't necessarily solved, but we do have a pretty good idea of what Toby's probably gonna do. If you head to the kitchen, you'll find that Chris is mixing themselves some chocolate milk while a mysterious voice on their phone speaks out to them. I don't know who this voice is, but something very suspicious happens later in Chapter 4. The voice says, "Susie can't get the guitar." And later in the chapter, through what I can only describe as Tom and Jerry adjacent shenanigans, the player ends up alerting Susie to the guitar's existence. Chris makes a call to this mysterious figure, and a few minutes later, Noel's mother shows up at the house earlier than she should. She kicks out Susie, sends Noel to the kitchen for punishment, and tells Chris they are always welcome in her house. Very strange the way the story is going out of its way to emphasize a relationship between Chris and Carol Holiday, despite the fact that the Holiday and the Dreamer families don't really talk anymore. As the two head back into Hometown, Susie kicks herself over the fact that she saw the code within the guitar, but didn't write it down before she was caught with it by Carol. Side note, despite Carol's reaction to Susie having the guitar probably being connected to some shenanigans with the spooky voice that Chris was talking to, I like the way that part of Carol's reaction almost comes off like somebody who kept their daughter's room completely in the state it was left in right around the time they went missing, and they're reasonably freaking out because this part of this person they've lost that they have control over keeping in their life, they lose control of being able to keep in the exact frozen state they want it to be in. I don't know, I look at that and I think of patterns of grief that either I've experienced firsthand or I've broadly seen from others, and it makes me wonder what Carol has to feel about the fact that her older daughter has just been inconspicuously missing for years now, and nobody really talks about it. Ever since Chapter 1, we've definitely been able to tell that there's this cloud of darkness hanging over Hometown, which everyone can feel is there, but nobody wants to talk about. It's incredibly sinister and foreboding, and it really makes me wonder just what's inside the bunker, to the point that everybody you ask about it in Chapter 4 tells you, hey, you should go there. You shouldn't even be thinking about going there. It's really freaky. Like, everybody is in on the darkness that's here, and all we understand about it outside looking in is just what we can glean from others. It's wonderful. I absolutely adore it. We have more than enough information to ask questions and even make some pretty conclusive points, but we don't have anywhere near the full picture, and we may never get the full picture. After leaving the holiday estate, it starts to rain outside in hometown, and you can explore a little bit, or you can try heading straight home, to which you'll find that you've been locked out. Susie mentions that Toriel might still be at church and that you should go bug her for the key to the house. But when you go to the church to find Toriel, you find a dark fountain inside the church instead. The two of you head inside the dark world, worrying that Toriel might be inside it and that the knight could be targeting them just like they were in chapter 3. I'm going to be honest when I say that I wasn't the biggest fan of a church dark world theme personally. I personally was a bigger fan of the idea of a dark world set in the holiday household specifically. Setting aside the opinions that I had amassed in the time that I was waiting for chapters 3 and 4, I was enjoying chapter 4. None of the enemy designs really stood out to me too much, but they were all still very fun to fight, and the actual look of the dark world itself, while being a little vague in areas, was still very pretty with the intricate sprite work. Unlike chapter 3, where my levels of fun with the chapter were high from the start, remaining consistently along those lines, chapter 4 was a little slower in areas, and I only really started to like it once certain moments started to hit me. Essentially, my love for chapter 4 wasn't love at first sight like it was with chapter 3. Instead, it was a steady trickle of moments that eventually collided together to give me an image of something I would fall in love with. One of the things I really enjoyed about chapter 4 early on was the way in which it pokes at and starts to acknowledge the prophecy. Ever since we learned about the roaring from Ralsei in chapter 2, we hadn't really covered the prophecy very much since. So not only do we get to learn more about the broader circumstances pushing the story forward, but we get to learn more about Ralsei as a character and the weight of having to hide so many things from our protagonists. If chapter 3 frames Ralsei in this way where you look at him and go, haven't you had an ounce of fun in your life? Chapter 4 makes you go, oh, that would explain why. Really, in general, chapter 3 and 4 do wonders for fleshing out Ralsei and Susie's personalities, and while Ralsei isn't the star of chapter 4's show, he definitely has his time in the limelight. As heartbreaking as it is to see unfold firsthand, I actually really love the writing on display with Ralsei and Susie's dynamic in chapter 4. Ralsei's having his own mini crisis, forming his own identity separate from the prophecy and the purpose he was made for, while Susie's arc is all about the idea of breaking out from the lines between things are written. Ralsei accidentally projects these feelings and fears he has onto Susie, making her insecure about the healing she wants to get better at. Despite Ralsei showing in this chapter that he feels the weight of being forced into a specific shape by the fact he knows the prophecy, he, in a sense, forces Susie into her own shape by the way he talks to her in this chapter. This conflict only really gets addressed at large when a character we meet in the dark world helps Susie realize that she doesn't have to follow words to a T. That's right, I'm talking about when Susie meets Gerson, our number one undisputed goat of this chapter. Gerson is the father of Alvin Boom, a turtle priest who runs the church in hometown. Gerson was the author of a famous series of books in universe called Lord of the Hammer. Before chapter 1 of Deltarune, Gerson died, but for whatever reason, he can be found in the chapter 4 Dark World, to which he plays the role of a considerate mentor figure for Susie. I absolutely adore the reasoning for how Gerson is alive in the Dark World while being dead in the Light World. Later in chapter 4, we find the dust from when Gerson died in the Light World, and Ralsei lets us know that people can be resurrected in some form within Dark Worlds if the person who made the dark fountain of that world has some kind of close connection to, or a lot of memories with, that individual. Which, that's a really cool way to bring a character back from the dead without bringing them back from the grave permanently. There's this bittersweet air to Gerson's jovial and comedic moments in the story because you're happy that he's here, but you can't get it off your mind that he's dead. This lines up pretty well with the climax of chapter 4, where we realize that Gerson cannot exist outside of the dark fountain whose memories brought him back to life in a sense. Once you seal the dark fountain, he's gone for good. just as quickly as he got back. It's some really good, really sad stuff, and I'm glad the story took this time to focus a bit on Gerson and what his perspective on storytelling within this story would have to offer for us. Gerson and Susie have a very heartwarming dynamic in this chapter of Deltarune, with Gerson basically constantly getting Susie worked up, only to use that as something to point at and say, "Ah, I like you, kiddo." I really like the way that the game lets you use an old man act through Chris's act menu once Gerson enters the story. It's just really funny to me the way he'll slide on and off screen, acknowledging that the battle UI is there, but not actually adhering to it. Not only does the game use this as a way to get a lot of good gags in, it also uses this as a way to characterize Gerson as somebody who knows more than most characters about the state of this universe. Once you complete a side objective to open up a secret door in Gerson's study, you'll be able to challenge the old man with just Susie in order to get access to a legendary hammer. I haven't mentioned the Chapter 3 secret boss in this video because frankly, I don't care about it. It was so out of the way on my playthrough, and I got locked out of it so early on that even having gone back to play Chapter 3 and 4, I didn't go out of my way to try and experience that secret boss. Now, Chapter 4 secret boss, meanwhile, I want to bring that up because I absolutely love it. Chapter 4 secret boss being the fight against Gerson to get access to this weapon for Susie. I really like the fact that this fight reintroduces the green shield soul from Undertale, but iterates on it in a Gerson adjacent theme, enough to feel original to how Deltarune uses it. The song that plays during this fight is really catchy, even though it is a Gerson themed remix of Undyne's theme Spear of Justice, or Spear of Justice is an Undyne themed remix of Gerson's theme Hammer of Justice. Either or, the song absolutely kicks ass and is one of my favorites in Chapter 4's OST. The fight itself is pretty difficult too. I've noticed actually that Chapter 3 and 4 of Deltarune have given me more trouble with Deltarune as a whole than I've ever experienced, which I've had more time with Chapter 1 and 2 for them to become easier to me, but I also remember not really having very many difficulties with Chapter 1 when it first released, besides for Jevel's fight. And it makes sense for a boss you need to go out of your way to fight to be harder than the main stuff. During Gerson's fight with Susie, he equates the prophecy that the whole of Chapter 4 shows us with the story of Lord of the Hammer, the book series that he wrote. The book series he also equates to Dragon Blazers, the in-universe RPG we hear about every time Deltarune wants to refer to itself. Gerson explains that the story of Dragon Blazers loosely pulls itself from Lord of the Hammer, and that Lord of the Hammer pulls itself from the prophecy, which is an in-universe religion worshipped by the Lightners. Gerson really goes out of his way to emphasize to Susie and us the player that just because something seems written in stone doesn't mean you need to follow it to a T, alluding to the idea that the story itself has yet to be finished and can very much be rewritten from where it currently seems to be going, which lines up very interestingly with Ralsei's internal struggle across Chapter 4 about the fact he knows the prophecy should be set in stone and he's scared about what's going to happen. Gerson is placed character-wise within Chapter 4 to defy the presence of the prophecy while still acknowledging its existence as a very real thing weighing on the story. And the way he does this through the language of storytelling itself within this story I find endlessly fascinating. So you beat Gerson, you get the whole monologue from him about how the future isn't set in stone, and now you're ready to move on to the rest of the Dark World. Before you leave though, Gerson asks you to deliver a letter to somebody in the Light World. Of course though, Gerson's letter cannot actually leave the Dark World itself, so he asks Susie to read it and transcribe it once they've left. Gerson wants Susie to deliver this letter to the priest of the church, Alvin, his son. And that just breaks my heart because as somebody who's lost people in my life, what I wouldn't give to get a letter from the grave. Especially after we find out that Alvin toned down his sermons at church because he didn't follow in his father's footsteps as an author, and he didn't want to feel like he was desecrating his father's legacy. I can just imagine this situation where Alvin checks out this mysterious letter that showed up on his desk, and he hears the words of this person close to him who's been gone for a really long time, words that he would have loved to hear when that person was still alive, but even though they're still gone now, It feels like for just a second they were with him once more. I just love absolutely everything to do with Gerson in chapter 4. He is by far my favorite thing from this chapter. Down to all the themes that tie in with his presence, to the way he's written for jokes, just for the way he's written for heartwarming narrative moments. Back when I first played Undertale and met Gerson in that, I wouldn't have expected years later for him to become one of my favorite characters in the next game Toby Fox would make. You know, despite the fact I wasn't really feeling the idea of covering the narrative content of Alvin and Gerson and the church in a dark world, I'm very glad that chapter 4 has done so. Before we kind of start to wrap up my thoughts on this chapter, I want to mention one thing from early chapter 4 that really stood out to me. Jackenstein's fight. Jackenstein is a mini-boss you need to beat in order to get access to the climbing gear item that allows you to access certain areas you've been seeing since the start of chapter 4. I have no other words to describe Jackenstein's fight other than fucking stupid, and I mean that in a completely endearing way. This mini-boss is actually quite interesting because it introduces you directly to some of the mechanics that would be used with the final foes of Chapter 4. The thing that really stands out about Jackenstein to me, and a lot of other people I imagine, is how the fight is a vehicle for Deltarune to be funny. Deltarune and Undertale do an amazing job of balancing the serious and silly within the same space, but sometimes Toby Fox feels like going a little bit more one way or the other, and with the Jackenstein fight, you can tell he wanted to be just a little more silly than he usually is for a little longer than usual. Trapping you in the battle UI with an enemy that says, "You're taking too long," and then Seton mixes that sentence over and over again for just hysterical results.
You're taking too long. You're taking too long.
I must know what was going through Toby Fox's head when he was coming up with this fight. If you tried to describe this fight to me before Chapter 3 and 4 released, I'd call you a liar. And I think that's just what makes it so funny to me. It's so absurd and unexpected. It really blindsided me on my first playthrough. The song for Jackenstein's fight is surprisingly catchy too. You're hearing it in the background right now, but we'll listen to an excerpt of it in its full entirety later in the video. The way Jackenstein helps the main characters get to the final boss I really like too. I just find it so interesting how a character like him, who is presented as an inconsequential side character at first, ends up playing actually a pretty crucial role in the story overall. It's nice to see that even Jackenstein can have a moment in the spotlight, which I recognize now as actually a very ironic thing to say, considering you meet Jackenstein and he's like, "No, don't shine that light in my face." So you head back to the start of the Dark World in order to climb up a surface that you couldn't access before. This sends you on a path towards sealing the Dark Fountain, but also towards colliding with the night once more. With one extended climbing sequence that has us exploring the idea of doing this under some kind of loss condition, like a time limit or taking too much damage, we finally get just close enough to the night before it escapes through a set of great doors, prompting Susie and Chris to head to the Dark Fountain now that the night is no longer stopping them. Chris seals the Dark Fountain and the two are sent back to the Light World. Except Susie and Chris can still see that trademark smoke of a dark fountain coming from inside the church itself. It seems as if they just sealed a dark fountain within the atrium. The two go snooping around the church to try and find some way to get through the locked door. This is where Susie discovers the dust that was Gerson, although at first she doesn't realize that this is the dust from the monster that has passed. With not much in the way of clues, Susie thinks maybe the old man in the Dark World knew how to access the locked door. Except they just closed that Dark World, so there's no way for them to access the old man, right? Of course, even knowing that making more could bring about the end of the world through the roaring, Susie decides to make a dark fountain anyways. This part of the story is where a lot of ideas I really like in this chapter finally come up. We're introduced to what multiple dark fountains made within the same area would look like, what multiple dark fountains would look like if one person made one of them, and then that one was sealed, and then another person made one in that same area. And with something we see occur relatively soon within the chapter, we get to see how a dark world might be influenced by someone's specific emotional state. A really cool thing about this specific plot beat is getting to see the way in which Susie, as somebody who doesn't go to church very often, interprets a church and how they influence the creation of a dark world in that setting. Like, this retroactively makes the aesthetic of the first dark world that we visit in the church very interesting, on the basis that there's this reverent, grandiose, larger-than-life look on the inside, but it also has to share space with these tight corners and book nooks that comprise the whole idea of Gerson being brought back to life and his thoughts and feelings influencing the Dark World in some way too. After wandering through the church Dark World B-side for long enough, Susie and Chris get separated as Susie comes face to face with something that is both the old man but not the old man. I missed the secret boss fight with the old man prior to this, so this was actually my first experience with the idea of fighting him, and it was very spooky. I really like the idea this section conveys, that Susie brought back the old man not as himself, but as something influenced by her sudden onset of grief and the fact that she doesn't really go to church and she didn't really know him. It's just very interesting the way this part of chapter 4 specifically conveys the finer minutia of how dark worlds are made and where they get their fundamental theming and ideas from. Chris eventually catches up to Susie and the two hold their own against this Gerson not Gerson, until Ralsei shows up and reveals that it was a reanimated statue. This whole fight, brief though it may be, still does an incredibly good job at setting a tone for the rest of the chapter. Also, again with the fact that Ralsei just happens to show up after a new dark fountain opens and our characters jump into it. No explanation on how he can move between dark fountains yet. He just can. This argument between Susie and Ralsei about the fact that Ralsei is actively hiding information from the Fun Gang by not bringing it up when relevant. Ooh boy, this has definitely been boiling over for a few chapters now. I mean, it plainly goes back to a line that Susie says in chapter 3. There's nothing that pisses me off more than people who don't tell you the whole deal. That's what Ralsei's been doing. It's no wonder Susie blows up on him in chapter 4, especially for the fact that he puts her down for basically trying to heal people because, what? Ralsei doesn't perceive Susie as a healer, he perceives that as his role. He tells Susie not to do something if she can't do it alone, but then proceeds to expect everybody to rely on him. And of course, I know Ralsei doesn't want to hurt anybody. He's very much genuinely doing this out of the good of his heart. But sometimes actions and intentions don't line up with the effect. Especially after all of the development that Susie gets in this chapter because of the old man trying to convince her to forge her own path, I really think that Susie standing up for herself like this was necessary. Ralsei reveals that he's been acting really weird this chapter because he knows that the prophecy will reveal itself to Susie and Chris, and he doesn't want them to see how it ends. So he's been trying to keep ahead of them to make sure they don't learn that. And he's been shouldering this burden, this fear of the absolute of something he believes is going to happen no matter what, all by himself. It might sound like I was quick to blame him for his behavior earlier, and to an extent I do think he should be blamed for being a little short-sighted, but overall, how would any of us act if we were in his situation? I don't blame him for trying to act in a way that he believes is best for Chris and Susie. He genuinely cares about them, and shouldering this burden of knowing so much, I assume he doesn't want that to spread to the people he cares most about. This whole sequence of entering a newly created dark world and then sealing it basically right after he opened it up, mwah, chef's kiss. I love you, Tony. Tony Fox. Tony Fox! Before Chris, Susie, and Ralsei can seal the dark fountain in this third dark world, the third encounter with the knight this chapter occurs. The trio are ambushed in the dark. The only way they're able to make it out of the situation being a mixture of each member tanking as many hits as they can for the other, and the light of Chris's soul keeping them safe. The imagery of this whole sequence is just incredibly evocative. The literal aura pushing them back, all of the swords shooting down at them from above, the characters pulling each other out of the way to take damage for each other. I just absolutely love this scene. It really feels like the emotional culmination of the vague arc we get across chapter 4, where the Fun Gang need to learn to rely on each other a little more. I won't lie, I teared up a little bit during the sequence when I first played it. I could feel the end of the chapter within reach, and I didn't want it to end. When Gerson asked Susie earlier how she would end the story, and she said she chooses eternity, for things to keep going on, for every day to be just like the last, well, that was really starting to speak to me at this point. Once final preparations are made, Susie, Chris, and Ralsei head towards the Dark Fountain and find themselves right in front of the Knight once more. Susie points out that the trio has cornered the Knight, and that there's a reason the Knight hasn't picked a fight with them in the Light World yet, suggesting that if Chris, Susie, and Ralsei were in the Light World with the Knight right now, they would jump their ass. Of course, though, for our recently unveiled main antagonist of Deltarune, thinly veiled threats aren't enough. If you thought the Knight was a power check that our main characters would struggle with, imagine one of the bosses you were told you would eventually have to go up against, something that would usher in the end of the world, showing up at the halfway point of this 7-chapter long game. Oh my god, the pseudo 3D in this climbing segment, so gorgeous. I love the way Toby's team is utilizing 3D more. I come to Deltarune for things like its love of storytelling / witty comedy writing, or the RPG gameplay, or even just the music. So stuff like this, Toby's team experimenting, really gets me excited. It's the unexpected stuff that sticks in my memory more. This is why I structured certain things in the video the way I did. I wanted to try and convey a microcosm of the feeling I had experiencing these sudden things for the first time. If I could capture and get across even just a small fragment of the way I felt seeing Tenna for the first time, or having to go up against the Knight for the first time, or witnessing a Titan be made for the first time, then I'll have done my job properly with this video. I find it incredibly interesting that Toby designed all the climbing sequences before this to prepare you for the end of the chapter, / how certain encounters before this, like with Jackenstein, actually prepare you for trying to get as much TP as possible to do a certain act to either help end the fight or hit some condition that will help you end the fight. After running away for a little bit, the futility of the situation sets in, as Chris, Susie, and Ralsei are forced to face the Titan head on. Not counting Gerson, because I didn't beat him on my very first playthrough of Chapter 4, this boss definitely stumped me the most. Some of the attack patterns for this boss are really brutal to dodge, and the damage they deal too can be really high, even if you're guarding. The reduced TP style of boss fight, like with Jackenstein 2, can just be really difficult as well. It demands you're able to survive long enough not just to actually beat the boss, but to figure out how to beat the boss, and to actually do the thing needed to beat the boss. It only takes maybe 3, 4, or 5 cycles of actually wailing on the boss after you remove its shield to get it to the point where the game gives you a cutscene and says you've basically won. Between managing healing, attacking, guarding, and trying to get as much TP as possible, this boss fight asks a lot of the player. If you're able to meet that difficulty though, and get the boss's health bar just low enough, you'll be able to experience quite possibly the coolest ending to any boss in Deltarune so far. When you get past that threshold to hit cutscene territory, the boss seemingly starts regenerating all of its health, with you unable to leave any more of a scratch on it. All hope seems lost. Our heroes, despite having fought so hard, haven't fought enough. If only they were just a little bit stronger, if only they had some extra help on their side. Oh, boo-hoo. All is for naught. If you've gotten this far into the video, you've almost certainly played Chapter 4. You know what's coming next, or rather, who's coming next. Sorry if my commentary and analysis got a little light there. I just had to let that scene play out as long as it did. Susie rushes ahead to speak to the old man, and Ralsei runs right behind her, trying to ensure that she doesn't see the last bit of the prophecy, which Ralsei knows is straight ahead. We follow behind Ralsei and enter into a scene with his shocked expression. Susie punches the glass screen with the prophecy on it, shattering it before we can see it. Ralsei begins frantically apologizing. Whatever Susie saw, she's not bothered by it. I really like the way that Susie tenderly cups Ralsei's cheek in her hand during this scene. I don't think she really knows what else to say to Ralsei besides for the fact that whatever the end of the prophecy entails, it cannot happen no matter what. Ralsei's thinking at the end of this chapter is incredibly grim. For a character who goes out of his way to try and remain consistently positive, to see him at his lowest point like this is heartbreaking. I want to reach through the screen and give him a big hug. There's this really weird feeling I have personally playing Deltarune where I know that I am robbing Chris of their agency as the player who possesses them and controls them. That said, I would like to think there are moments throughout all the chapters where your thinking as the player aligns with what Chris is thinking. And this moment where you can say to Ralsei, it's okay not to smile, I believe is something Chris truly would have said in that moment on their own, were it not an option that we wanted to say. There's a lot of weird things you can do towards and surrounding Ralsei throughout all of the chapters, things that Chris doesn't really have a say in, but with this decision here, I feel confident in saying at least that the sincerity on display is probably how things would have gone either way. This line where Ralsei compliments Chris on their playing of the piano, I really like. I just really wish all of these characters would get a happy ending, Ralsei included. Chris makes their way towards the Dark Fountain, ready to seal it beside Susie, bringing this new adventure to a close. Susie's smile, which seemed to defeat everything, shined on in front of you, and for a moment, it was as if all the darkness had been blown away. As if in imitation, your soul began to glow. When I heard that first note of It's Raining Somewhere Else 27 seconds into this new track called The Place Where It Rained, it felt like all of these years of waiting for Deltarune after Undertale came full circle. I really love the melancholy attitude that Chapter 4 has after you exit the Dark World. This song absolutely contributes to that feeling. Going into Gerson's grave after this Dark World really is one of the biggest reality checks you can get in Deltarune so far. This man, he influenced you, he changed you for the better, he was just in front of you, and now he's gone for good. There's not very much to do in Hometown right now. Not only is it laid out, but it's been raining all day. Still, the game doesn't stop you from sitting around and letting the moment soak in a little bit. Because there aren't very many places still open for us to visit, or any people out at all that we can talk to, we won't spend too long out here. The shifted atmosphere started with the end of Chapter 3 and continued with the end of Chapter 4 is wonderful. It's one of my favorite things about this batch of content we've gotten. It's like there's this cloud of uncertainty hanging over the whole story in the world, like everything is just a little darker than it was when we started. Part of something that's always excited me about the premise of Deltarune was the eventual assumption that the darkness, which seemed to run parallel to a lot of the fun stuff, would eventually come up and start to take more and more prevalence. There's a transitional quality to the story contents of Chapter 3 and 4, where it really feels like the Deltarune that we knew before has been changed in some fundamental way. And in a way, the story has been altered in some fundamental way that it can't walk back from. Like it or not, the characters are on a collision course straight to the ending of the prophecy. What was once almost dreamlike adventures in other worlds without consequences has become a very real thing affecting the world in very real ways. And that reality can't just be drowned in something else. It is up front, it is in your face, it is unabashedly unavoidable. Whether things will ever go back to how they used to be is unknown. Safe to say, both the characters and us the audience are feeling the pressure of what has yet to come. Before we head back home to conclude Chapter 4, let's listen to some of the music I really liked from this chapter. I'll be omitting one song I otherwise would have included because I want to play it in its entirety at the end of the video. Chapter 4's original soundtrack definitely feels like it has a lot more iconic tracks when compared to Chapter 3. I definitely find myself preferring the moodier attitude that a lot of the songs take. It feels like everything in Chapter 4 is just appropriately grandiose and atmospheric for where the plot is going and where it could go from here. If I had to say one thing negative though, I'd say I'm not currently sold on the musical identity for the Darkness Spawn and the Titans. We'll have to see how my opinion changes over the next few months and years though. Since we've spent more than enough time sitting at this lake, let's finally head home for the night. As you and Susie head home, you find a drunk Toriel partying with Sans the skeleton. Toriel ended up canceling choir practice because of the rain. She was never in the Dark World in the first place. There's this very tonally inappropriate atmosphere to suddenly stumbling on Toriel having a night of fun after everything that happened in Chapter 4. Chris and Susie went through some pretty heavy stuff under the assumption that Toriel was in danger, but she was never in danger to begin with. I imagine the audience is sort of meant to say, what's the point, in the same way that Susie and Chris might be asking that question at this moment. The fandom reaction to this scene after it released has been pretty decisive in framing Toriel as a negligent mother, and while her behavior could be framed as negligent, I also understand that, yeah, she's a divorced mother, she deserves to have a night of fun. It's weird though, because it feels like that night of fun kind of comes at the expense of Chris in a few ways. Like the fact that Toriel doesn't even think to look for them after church when it starts raining, or even just her quiet acceptance of the fact that Chris will disappear from the house for hours at a time. There's a tendency within fandom spaces to want to flatten characters, and I don't want to flatten Toriel here into either good mom or bad mom. I think she can both genuinely love and care for Chris, while also acting in a way that isn't completely responsible. I'm happy at least broadly the fandom does seem to be discussing this in regards to what it could mean for Chris's home life. Like, we've had an idea for a while now that Chris's home life has been strained between the divorce, feeling like they live in the shadow of Azrael, and just in general not feeling comfortable in their own body as the only human in a town full of monsters. I find it so interesting that Chapter 4 hammers in the reality of the situation and just how dangerous dark fountains could get, while in the same breath very clearly showing a situation in which a character would likely want to escape to a dark world even knowing what they know. I don't think it's too out of the question, at least, to see Deltarune doing this and think, damn, for as dangerous as it can be to try and escape from your real life problems, sometimes your real life problems just can't be solved in a straightforward way, and escapism is the only form of relief one can get. Isn't it just an extra special kind of depressing to save the world from destruction and then go home and still have to deal with your broken family? With not much else to do around the house, Chris heads to bed early for the night. Toriel and Sans partied late into the night, keeping up Chris, who was tossing and turning in their bed, having torn out their soul, throwing it in the birdcage in their room. Chris hears Susie's voice, despite the fact she already left earlier in the night. We don't know who Susie was speaking to before this, nor do we know what she said.